Welcome to Making Peace Visible, the podcast about peace and conflict in the media. I'm your host, Jamil Simon. How do you measure peace in a country? Do you look at the rate of violent crime? Assess the judicial system? What about freedom of the press, the health of the economy, or general happiness? What can we learn from measuring peace? It turns out we can learn a lot. Today's guest is in the business of measuring peace. Steve Killelea is the founder of the Institute for Economics and Peace, an internationally renowned think tank that measures peace in several different ways. IEP researchers draw on reams of data to determine how the world is doing when it comes to peace and conflict. They also study the elements that make peaceful societies, things like strong social cohesion, satisfactory living standards, and resilience to crisis. Each year, IEP publishes the Global Peace Index, the Positive Peace Index, and many policy briefs distilled from the research. IEP's work promotes peace as a positive, achievable state of well-being. It also serves as a kind of warning system in times like the one we're living in, where violent conflict is on the rise in many parts of the globe. His research has also quantified the incredibly high costs of war. Steve, welcome to Making Peace Visible, and thank you for your important work.
Well, thank you for having me on the phone, Jamil. It's great to talk to you again, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
One issue that I've encountered during this work, and I'm sure you have too, is that different people have very different ideas about the meaning of the word peace. Depending on who you ask, peace could be an internal, individual state. It could mean the absence of armed conflict. For some people involved in a conflict like in Ukraine and the Middle East, peace sounds like giving up, like surrender. Briefly, how do you define peace, Steve?
Well, peace and defining peace depends on the outcome which I'm trying to achieve. And as you quietly point out, there are many, many, many different forms of peace. So if you look at it from a Buddhist perspective, personal peace, that's the absence of afflictive emotion, for example. Others, and quite often referred to in the press, as when the guns fall silent and the war is stopped. That's peace. But is it truly peace? So we're looking inside the Institute for Economics and Peace. We have a number of different definitions we use. The first revolves around what you would call negative peace. That's the absence of violence or fear of violence. Now, we use that, let's say, in the construction of the Global Peace Index. So we use that there. And that's great because it gives a whole lot of quantifiable measures which can actually measure. But the problem with the concept of negative peace, or the absence of violence and fear of violence, it tells you if you're peaceful, but it doesn't tell you anything about the structures which actually create for a peaceful society. So the second body of work we've got is a body called positive peace. And now the definition of peace there is the attitude, institutions and structures which create and sustain peaceful societies. And now that gives them now the ability to be able to construct indexes so we can actually look at the underlying qualities within a society which actually create a resilient peace, one which is that withstands outside pressures and one which is resilience to change.
Why is it important to differentiate from, say, regular peace and positive peace?
Well, I think the important thing with positive peace is, so maybe I'll just go into it a little bit more detail. So having constructed the Global Peace Index, what we do then is we've got about 25,000 different data sets we use, which we then use mathematical modelling, statistical analysis to determine what factors are most closely associated with peace. And that's what we call a positive peace in the absence of violence or fear of violence. Now, what we do then with that is now we take that and turn it around into another index. So we use some statistical techniques which then take and clump those various factors together which are highly statistically related to peace. Now we can take that and we can now call the positive peace index. But what's more important, and this is really quite profound, those same qualities which create peace also create a whole range of other things which we think are important for societies to thrive. For example, higher per capita income. Countries which are improving in positive peace, on average, have 2% per annum higher GDP growth rates than countries which are deteriorating in positive peace. Measures of well-being and happiness are statistically highly aligned with positive peace. Better performance on a whole range of developmental outcomes, for example. You also see it in related to better performance on the ecology. Look at positive peace in this light. In many ways, it describes an environment in which human potential can flourish.
Well, from your index, 2023 was the most violent year globally since the global index was launched in 2009. Why is that?
Well, we're just about to launch this year's Global Peace Index. And sort of what we can see, things are even worse this year. So what we can see is the number of countries involved in an international conflict, the highest it's been since the Second World War. In fact, 92 countries were involved in a conflict in another country. Now, not all those are bad. A lot of them are regional peacekeeping bodies and such, but a lot of other ones are various actors which are trying to support their country's interests in different places as well. We're seeing a rise in great power rivalries. So particularly we can see that between Russia, it's US, and also between the Western European powers as well. So what we're seeing is a whole range of factors. Other ones, for example, the number of unresolved conflicts at the moment are the highest they've been since the Second World War. And so a lot of these are just very minor conflicts, under 25 battlefield deaths a year. But if we go back and we look at the 2019, Ethiopia, Gaza, and Ukraine were all small conflicts. The potential for more and new ones to rise has never been higher. And in fact, in 2023, 97 countries out of the 163 were measured deteriorating in peace. That's the most we've seen since we've been doing the index. A lot of that comes back to Western Europe and the Ukraine.
Is the outlook better or different if you're measuring positive peace?
Yeah, well, this is the interesting thing. The underlying factors for many of the parts of positive peace were improving up to COVID. Now, since COVID, positive peace has deteriorated. So the attitudes in many ways globally are deteriorating, and particularly see that in the West. So you'll see that through fractionalized elites, freedom of the press, and a number of other measures as well. We can also see that authoritarianism globally is rising as well. And so now when we look at things like free flows of information because of the internet mainly, that's increased quite dramatically. And this is different for many countries, but globally, many of the qualities which we associated with the well-being are improving. So that'd be length of life, for example, access to education, healthcare, those things are on the rise. But we can see that corruption globally is deteriorating, and we can see that well-functioning government globally is also deteriorating. So a lot of the time, the devil's in the detail.
It's surprising, for example, that the U.S. is ranked below countries like Honduras. And ironically, people are escaping those countries to come to America.
Well, it depends which index you're looking at. So if you're looking at the Global Peace Index, that's true. Now, the reason for the lower ranking for the United States is its militarization and the number of conflicts it's involved in. Now, by global standard, it does have a high homicide rate, but its homicide rate is much, much lower than somewhere like Honduras, for example. Now, if you come back to positive peace, which is the measure of the underlying wellness, if you like, of a society, you find that the US, although it has dropped substantially over the last 5 years, is still really quite high. It's, from memory, it's up and around the mid-20s, somewhere like that. Whereas Honduras, if you went there, I'm sure it'd be in the bottom half of the positive peace index.
Well, economics is, after all, your middle name, so to speak. And I would like to explore the economic issues related to war and conflict. I assume that you have data that demonstrates that countries in peace are far better off economically than countries suffering from war and violence. If more countries, and specifically the people in those countries, understood that correlation better, presumably they would place a higher value on pushing for peaceful solutions to conflict.
Logically, I'd say that's right, Jamil. Logically, that's right. But I think the biggest message is for business. So if we look at it in the year 2023, the cost of violence to the global economy was $17.5 trillion. Like that's equivalent to about 11.5% of global GDP. And that really is a large number. So now, to put that in perspective, if you could decrease the cost of violence to the global economy by 10%, that'd be like adding 3 new countries to the world, the size of Ireland, Switzerland and Norway. And now, to make it even more ridiculous, when we look at the amount of money we spend on peace building and peacekeeping operations, it's 0.1% of the amount of money of the cost of violence, $17.5 trillion.
It seems like it might be a good idea to invest elsewhere.
This is it. The issue is sort of what drives investments. And a lot of the time with governments, particularly in the Western democracies, are very reactive. So the terms range, depending on the type of the democracy, from about 2.5 years on average up to 5 years. And so this creates for short-termism. The building of peace is a long-term effort. It's almost intergenerational. Well, it is intergenerational if you really want to build positive peace and those qualities which create for a vibrant, robust and thriving society.
What does war do to a country's economy?
Well, it cripples them. I was just looking at some figures for Syria, for example. The GDP in, I think it was 2022, was the 8% of what it was prior to the war. 8%. It had dropped 92%. We've used fairly conservative statistics. If you look at the Ukraine today, its GDP is probably down 40%.
That's huge. Well, looking at it from the other, the positive side, I mean, your colleague, Michael Collins, pointed out that by improving the level of peacefulness in your country, your economy or GDP could go up as much as 25%.
Well, that's right. So one of the studies we did, we looked at the countries which had the highest improvements in positive peace and went back a decade and then tracked the improvement in their GDP compared to the global average. And over a decade, it was 34% higher.
That's a major dividend.
That's a compounding effect of what happens when you focus on those qualities which improve peace. But what we don't want to lose sight of, it's those qualities which improve peace also create all the other things for a robust society to thrive as well.
Like education,
free flow of information. Obviously, a lot of it comes through the internet, but it's also like just the ability to be able to transparently price a transaction. So it means if you're investing, you've just got a lot more information to make wise investments.
Some people point to the impact of military expenditures as a positive for the economy. Indeed, many of our best brains are focused on making more effective weapons, but those same engineers and scientists and the money that pays them could be focused on solving problems like climate change, healthcare, energy conservation, all the good stuff.
Yes, that's all very, very true. So if we start to look at this and start to look at it in a little bit more detail, what you find is that there are a lot of very, very good investments which come out of the military. But the bigger question is, would the money be better if it was funded somewhere else? And the answer to that is yes. So now the military is good up to a point, and that point is what do you need to adequately protect your society and to be able to provide good peacekeeping operations to support other like countries. Now, any money spent beyond that is wasted money because let's face it, say you develop a new aircraft carrier. Now, in developing that new aircraft carrier, you're probably going to spend some billions of dollars. It's now going to cost the hundreds of millions of dollars to run per annum. It's probably got some 1,000 troops on it. It burns up fuel. You now develop a whole lot of weapons to put on it. And now if you don't use it, that's sunk money. Now, sure, there may be some off-spins from the technology developed for it, which get used private enterprise. But if you were to put that money and put it into building infrastructure, put it into stimulating sunrise industries, the economic return for society would be much, much stronger.
Let me talk about the media a little bit, about reaching the news media. I mean, IEP has made very strong efforts in the past to engage journalists in understanding the information that you've produced. And I know you personally have made yourself available to journalists all over the world. But talk to us about your experience promoting your research among journalists and news organizations.
It's changing, certainly changed the last 15 years. So what we're finding more is the access to news is becoming much more dispersed, particularly with the rise of social media, the internet and such. For example, Institute for Economics and Peace, it puts out a newsletter each week called Future Trends, where it looks at the news and takes the news and tries to give some insights into where the world's going. And so there's an example of us producing news, and like 20 years ago, you would have never thought of doing it.
When you explain what you do to journalists, do you think they get the core ideas? I mean, if not, what are they missing?
I think a lot of the time, yes, I think they get the core ideas, but to actually get your head wrapped around something like positive peace takes time, energy and effort. Whereas to get your mind wrapped around the measures of violence, because we all know them, it doesn't take much time at all. So it's very hard to get positive peace, but we're starting to look with, in fact, we're going to be doing it over the next couple of months. We've got it already on the drafting board, looking at mechanisms to try and take positive peace and seeing if we can get headlines around them. So we'll have a couple of PR pushes around it.
That's great.
And again, it comes back to using these constructive journalism approaches. So that's one of the new things I want to play with in the near future.
Yeah, no, and there's also another way of looking at things called solutions journalism, which is similar to constructive journalism. But one thing I've noticed over time is that IEP has gotten better at visualizing the data you've created, because visualizing it is very important to build understanding.
But beyond that, being able to take the kind of research we do and put it into ways which are simple to read, which the average person can read, because a lot of the time, the research work which comes out in the peace arena, it's academic in nature. It's very, very hard for the average person to consume. And I guess part of that comes back to my background in business, having set up a couple of global IT companies. In that, you've got a strong emphasis on marketing. We put a lot of emphasis too on trying to remove any emotionality from the work either, because we're really about trying to present the facts and do it with data rather than talk to issues morally or things like that. So we avoid criticising governments. Even governments we really detest, because sometimes we end up going back and working into these countries in some shape, way or form. And so if you can do some good to change the underlying paradigms, that's great. Attacking them, well, that just makes it that much harder for us to run positive peace workshops and exercises in those countries. And what we find is that facts speak for themselves. So if you put up the facts on, let's say, the number of extrajudicial killings in a country, well, that speaks for itself. You don't have to talk to the detail.
That's a compelling fact, exactly. I mean, in many countries, including America, media polarization goes hand in hand with political polarization, and it can lead to violent conflict. We hope that's not going to happen through this election. But and then there's the problem of how little news coverage there is of peace efforts, which we talked about already. But this is central to the mission of this podcast. Where do you see the role of the media in the positive peace equation?
If we're looking at through the lenses of which we think about, Jamil, and we look at the, let's say, constructive journalism, what needs to be done is for the media to understand how it can take positive messages, market them to be able to improve their coverage rather than falling back on fear-based media to be able to get eyeballs to read what they're doing or look at what they're portraying. So I think that's the key thing. That's a lot easier said than done. The other thing too is if we start to look at, this is one of the beauties of positive peace. When we put this into workshops, what we do is it's constructive in nature. And so it's always a workshop structured around trying to find a solution to a problem. And then if you've got a shared problem, then people will work out a shared vision to be able to solve that problem. And so I think there needs to be a lot more energy put into to constructively work out where the middle ground is, particularly in America, where the middle ground is how do you work for solutions which work for both sides, for problems which you both identify, and the things where you disagree and which are irreconcilable, leave them to the side. And you can come back to them later if you're in a much better frame of mind and you can see the good in the other person. Quite often, particularly in the States, people are driven by values, but they miss the underlying ethics of people. So you could be pro-abortion, you could be anti-abortion, but you basically still be quite an honest person. You've just got different moral views around that particular issue. If both people can be highly honest, won't be corrupt, can be quite nurturing, looking after the people within their own environment. So how do you come back and try and find the values which connect people rather than disconnect people? And so the media, if it can focus on things like that, I think that in terms of in the American setting anyway, go a long way to creating a better and more positive society. Because coming from Australia, we can have radically different political views and we're okay with it. We're quite happy to sit down and go out to dinner with them. That's not what we judge people by. And so I think in many countries, there's a need to move beyond what I'd see as superficial values and try and look at the person and their underlying values.
You know, there's something that you do that's different from all the research that you do through the IEP. And that is you've been a very strong supporter of conflict resolution education for young people. And I think you've been doing it mostly through Rotary. Is that right? Or
yeah, well, we've got a number of different ways. So we're working with Rotary, and so we've got a partnership with Rotary. So we're training people which are called Rotary activators, and they're about sort of working on trying to create peace using positive peace architecture in many different parts of the world. So we got trained people in Africa, we've trained them in Europe, we've trained them in the US, Latin American, and we're currently in the process of training them in Asia. And so that's one of the projects. We also got a whole lot of online courses which we've developed with Rotary as well. And so they've probably, I think about 60,000 Rotarians have now taken that from different parts of the world. We're also working with governments like the Philippines government. They're rolling out positive peace in every province or every municipality within the country as well. Prison officers, one point there, we had about 20,000 people involved in the criminal justice system. They're taking a course over a 2-month period.
wow,
We've got online courses which are for positive peace. They're simple. Anyone who's interested in that, that's about 2 hours to really get across it and understand it. So if you go to visionofhumanity.org, very easy to register there, or just look up positive peace training and that'll get you there as well.
great.
We also run IEP ambassador courses, and to date, we've trained about 5,500 IEP ambassadors globally, and that's in over 150 countries. The biggest 2 cohorts we got is in Nigeria and Ethiopia, countries suffering from conflict. Quite often the people in countries suffering from conflict, the ones who are most interested in learning about peace.
Absolutely. Yeah, they're motivated. Stephen, we've covered a lot of ground. I really appreciate you giving us this time. Is there anything I didn't ask you that you think is important to share?
Yeah, I think in wrapping up, what I'd like to say is the word peace, with a lot of politicians, they find it very, very difficult to talk about. So setting up the Global Peace Index, a lot of people advised me to drop the word peace. It could have easily been the Global Violence Index, but I wanted to study peace, so I put the word in there. Part of it is breaking down that concept of peace as being something which is fluffy, something about peace being altruistic and not being very practical. And I think in many ways, for all of us moving in the peace movement, we need to get a lot more focused on how do we actually make peace something which is practical, something which is tangible, and appeals to the broad population, middle class, and especially business. Because if we come back to the areas where we're talking about business earlier on, the biggest benefit from peace is business. It's really important. We've got a report called Business and Peace Report, and then also another one, the Economic Cost of Violence for the Global Economy. The Business and Peace Report specifically speaks to business. And so how do we get more work done inside chambers of commerce so they can actually understand that relationship between business and peace? Just to give you a couple of quick examples, I've already mentioned the 2% per annum improvement in GDP, but things like interest rates are lower, inflation rates 7 times less volatile, foreign direct investments twice as big, sovereign debt ratings tend to improve, currencies, exchange rates tend to improve. And so this alignment between business and peace is massively important. So if you're going to invest, you should invest in the countries with the highest improvements in positive peace, because they're going to have the higher GDP growth rates and the higher market growth rates.
Well, I hope our governments start investing more in peace and less in war. Their dividends would be so much better.
Absolutely, 100%.
Well, Steve, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate your getting up very early in the morning to talk to us. It was really a pleasure.
Oh, it's a great conversation. It's always good to talk to you, Jamil, and I've enjoyed myself very much.
You can download the latest Global Peace Index and Positive Peace Report and see how your country measures up at economicsandpeace.org. You can also sign up for an interesting newsletter that IEP publishes called Future Trends. The Institute also publishes a lot of analytical briefs based on the research at their other website, visionofhumanity.org. This is where you can find courses based on the research, as well as courses on dealing with conflict more effectively. Making Peace Visible is produced by Andrea Maraskin, with help from Faith McClure. The Associate Director of Making Peace Visible is Stephen Youngblood. Special thanks this week to Michael Collins, the head of IEP in the U.S. Thanks so much for listening, and talk soon.